This is exciting.
Yes, it is.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. Today, John and I will be talking about and hopefully learning a thing or two about some of the latest camera features that, according to the experts, improve our bird and wildlife photography. In addition to technical wizardry, we plan on discussing technique and what motivates our guests to head out into the wild in order to capture the beautiful images that make them stand out from the crowd. Let's welcome our guest. First up is David Speiser, who has joined us in the past to discuss bird photography and ultra-telephoto lenses. David is a member of the board of directors of New York City Audubon Society and the founder of lilybirds.com. We also welcome to our show Grace Scalzo to the program. Grace is a bird and wildlife photographer from Spring Branch, Texas, and the author of 2 photography books for children. It's a treat to welcome both of you to the show. Welcome, guys.
Hello. Hey.
Okay, now, Dave, let's start with you. Since we last spoke, you went full Monty with mirrorless cameras, and you're now shooting with Canon R system. How'd this come about? Have you been listening to those know-it-alls and those big city photography podcasts again? You know, we warned you about those demons, but seriously, what made you make the switch? Did you wait for the R5, R6? What is it, a feature or a lens? And Grace, by the way, you can either wait patiently your turn or jump in whenever you want to tell David why he is not right. Okay? So there's the rules, guys. You're
okay.
David, go.
well, I first want to say third time is the charm. I'm very pleased to be back.
Great having
podcast.
You. Always.
In February of 2020, I was lucky enough to be one of the first people to get a Canon 1DX Mark III.
Mm-hmm.
20 megapixel, full frame, very fast pro camera, 12 or 14 frames a second. I don't know, some ridiculous number. And I had the opportunity to shoot with it for about 4 months. But I was eagerly watching Canon rumors every day to find out when this R system was going to hit and what the specs were going to be. And when they started to say that the camera was going to be, the R5 that is, was going to be 45 megapixels, 12 frames or 14 frames or 18 frames a second, the silent potential of a silent shutter, I was thinking, wow, it just opens up so many possibilities that I was very excited. But meanwhile, I was very happy with the autofocus system, the 1DX Mark III. Mm-hmm. It was really improved. So in situations where previous iterations of the cameras would get fooled on autofocus, let's say birds in flight with a busy background, let's say a bird flying over the water with waves, and a lot of times the camera would just lock onto the waves and have a very difficult time tracking the bird. So I love bird flight photography, and this camera seemed to do a really pretty good job. So let's say a hit rate of 50% or something. But finally, the rumor came through. Canon makes the announcement, R5, and I pre-ordered the camera. And I'm lucky enough, we're away again this time in Maine, and it was sent up to me, and I had it in July. And right away, I took it out, and I was able to shoot hummingbirds. And I was able to, I should say, so the enticing features and what really did it, 45 megapixels, ultra fast frames per second. The big one is the animal detect eye function, where the camera can lock on the animal, on the eye of an animal, and even a bird, maybe even an insect. So if the bird's just flying into your screen and you have the animal detect, it picks it up. It will lock on no matter what the background is. It is truly incredible.
You know, on that note, by the way, I got to tell you that when the R5 and R6 came out, I was in with the video crew. We did the initial videos to introduce the camera before they were officially announced. So for about 2 weeks, we had them here. And I used both of those cameras with the telephoto lenses, including the 6 and 800. And we were in Van Cortlandt Park, which you may or may not know is probably the closest thing to Native American forests in North America.
Old growth, yes.
Oh yeah, but we were. There's a pond there, and I was several hundred feet away. There was a snowy egret, and it locked onto the eyes of this bird. It really found it. It was not the bird; it was the eyes. So you're right about that. It really does work, and they lock on and they stick to it. It's phenomenal technology.
It's with photography, it's everything is always a compromise. Your shutter speed goes up, your aperture goes down. Your aperture goes down, your shutter speed goes up. You need your shutter speed to go up. You have to increase your ISO. Therefore, your noise goes up. It's always a losing battle. However, with this camera, I can shoot now comfortably at ISO 3200 or ISO 4000 even. So shutter speed becomes less of an issue, which means I can shoot in dark situations. It also, I should say, has an incredible IBIS, in-body image stabilization. So it's like 5 or 6 stops. So then you could really shoot in extremely low light situations at high ISO with little noise at 45 megapixels and lock onto the eye of a bird. What could be better? So basically, you can, as a photographer, you can actually think composition first, text later. It's almost cheating. On the other hand, it's a whole new way of shooting. So you can still shoot the old way without eye detect. And what makes it great is the camera, basically every single button on the back of the camera is customizable. So you can lock in old way of shooting without eye detect, one button, and then, have your regular shutter button set that way. And then if you press, let's say, the asterisk button, it goes into eye detect. So you could be shooting two ways. And it's just, for the photographer, it gives you so many possibilities. You're not yelling at your technology. Why isn't this focusing? God damn it, I suck.
And David, when you say the old way, I'm curious how that plays out exactly with what you're doing, what thought process you're putting in when you're doing it the old way.
I was going to ask the same thing. Yeah, how you say it's changed? What has changed exactly?
Well, for example, if there's a flying bird in the sky, and I wasn't using eye detect, the camera does something, or the lens with the camera goes back and forth trying to find the focus of the bird in the sky. And a lot of times,
looking for a good piece of contrast to lock onto.
Looking for something to focus.
Yeah.
And when you're shooting at extreme focal lengths, your point of view is very, very small. So if you're off, you're never finding the bird in the sky. Basically, soon with the new technology, and you have eye detect set, as soon as the bird comes into the frame, the camera is locking onto the bird. And then it sticks with the bird. In the past,
amazing. Yes.
In the past, you still have to constantly pump the shutter button to stay in focus and try to keep up with the bird, but the birds fly erratically. So you're missing. You're focusing on the tail. You're focusing on wingtip. You're focusing around the bird. Here, it's locked on. It is truly incredible. It's not foolproof. If there's a warbler in a thicket, the camera has a very difficult time finding the subject.
I'll also add to that, by the way, when I was shooting that egret in Van Cortlandt Park, the background was incredibly cluttered and busy. There was all kinds of foliage and leaves and branches, yet it still found the eye in the midst of this clutter. And it was maybe 1/8 of the entire area of the frame. That's what I'm saying. It's pretty incredible. It found this tiny thing in that mess of visuals.
Right. And again, that it could work 80% of the time, but when we're out, and Grace can attest to this, oftentimes you don't get a second opportunity. So as the photographer, you have to make the choice, what's going to give you the highest percentage of a hit rate. So in a situation where I know that there's a bird in a thicket as opposed to a cluttered background, if there was a cluttered background, I would go with the eye detect. But if it's in amongst the environment, I still think the best way is you put your focus point in the middle and you try to hit the focus point on the subject. And then once you have that, then just with your thumb, you flick to eye detect and you lock onto it. So it's a new way of shooting. It's a new way of thinking. You have to know where your hand placements are. But once you've taken, a few thousand pictures, you're pretty well attuned to it.
So here's a question I have based on what you just said, and this is for both of you. You're each using essentially state-of-the-art equipment to pursue your kind of photography. Now, you've both been doing this going back to manual focus film days, and now we're dealing with the latest state-of-the-art technologies in digital. What is the increase of your keepers? I mean, back in the day, you got a keeper. It was a big deal. You jump up and down and throw out, 34 slides because 2 of them came out. But now I'm assuming your success rates and your rate of keepers is much higher. What's the percentage now from what you shoot to what you keep? Or how would you say it was improved percentage-wise, or any other way you could compare it from back in the film days, manual exposure where it was all a matter of skill and luck, and now there's a lot more going on. Our equipment is supporting us a lot more to get what we see.
Just to jump in quickly, and then I'll let you take the floor finally, Grace. My keeper rate is very high now. Probably my out of focus shots are probably less than 5%.
Okay, that's significant.
But that doesn't mean that every shot's a keeper, because the birds move around, their positions wrong, their heads turn.
But technically, you got it. Because how many times did you say it was a gorgeous shot, but I missed? Now you're hitting every focus, and now it's a matter of what moment.
It's very infrequent. And as I mentioned, with the 1DX Mark III, with the birds in flight backgrounds, I was maybe getting 50%, 60% in focus. And with this camera, once you learn the technique and how to do it, it's probably above 90%. Very rare that you miss a sequence, but again.
And what was the learning curve? How long did it take you to kind of get comfortable?
I'm really fast, so it did not take me too long. It took me longer just to get accustomed to the ergonomics of, and then just the final tweaking of the settings, but pretty darn quickly.
So let me jump in here, because I've been listening to David's wonderful description of this new system, and I just have a few things I'd like to add. David, I was invited to tell you why you are wrong in terms of the system that you chose, and I absolutely cannot. You are 100% right in everything that you've said so far, and I will soon be adding a mirrorless body to my collection of cameras. I'm going to have to sell a few and make a few changes and whatnot. I'm currently shooting with a 1DX Mark II. I have a 1DX, a 5D Mark IV. My main lens for bird photography is the 600 f4 version 3, of course, with teleconverters. I also have the Canon 100 to 400, the Sigma 150 to 600. Those are kind of my go-to lenses. And then I have a little stable of macro lenses and stuff like that. I think it might be helpful for me to tell your listeners why I hesitated in terms of taking the plunge right away like David did. First of all, there were a few kinks being reported in the new systems, and I kind of wanted to let those get worked out before I jumped in. And also the adapters in the beginning were a little bit difficult to find, the ones that would enable you to pair a mirrorless camera with the EF lenses.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
So that was one reason. The other thing is I tend to be a bit of a guerrilla when I shoot. I take good care of my equipment. I'm not going to tell you that I don't, but it's not unusual to find me laying flat in the mud, gear covered in mud, myself covered in mud. Maybe 2 cameras, one laying on the ground beside me. And the mirrorless, the R5, doesn't have the build of the Pro body. There was also a little bit of discussion about battery life and that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to have to mend my ways and be a tiny bit more cautious with my gear. Again, I don't break stuff, but I do use it and use it pretty hard. And one of my other concerns had to do with the way I shoot. Where I live is the Texas Hill Country, and our land is partially being restored to a savanna grassland, and the other part is a riparian woodland. And in that woodland part, we have some beautiful endangered species. The famous Texas golden-cheeked warbler lives there. We had a real nice little fox den a couple of years. Those are low light situations. The hiking is difficult. It's steep, it's rocky, and it's not unusual for me to take my body and a lens on a strap and hike in there without a tripod, without support. So I was not sure if I could handle 45 megapixels in a low light situation with, that high resolution and still get those tack sharp handheld photos that are kind of, I would say, my signature. Both David and I toss anything that isn't sharp. Yes, we've got software these days that will help us, but it's just not the same as that sharp initial capture. So I do feel that the DSLR will probably remain a tool in my kit, but I'm looking forward to learning the mirrorless systems for all the reasons that David so carefully talked about. I was a bit concerned about the learning curve, but I've got that solved. Any questions? Just going to ask David.
There you go.
There you go.
And David, how does that play out with you? I mean, because some of the things Grace mentioned are really would be concerns of mine, specifically the build and the resolution. I mean, do you appreciate the 45 megapixels, and do you utilize that in the sense of cropping when you need to? Or has it been a problem to some degree? And also about the body, have you had any problems there?
First of all, the build quality is outstanding. I have an R5 and an R6. It's pretty much the same chassis, and I always shoot with a grip. So I have decently sized hands, and the ergonomics are fantastic. The build quality is on par with, let's say, the 5D4, probably better than a 7D2. So build quality is not an issue. It's
David, not to interrupt, David, but can you take them out? Can you take them out in the rain? Like, for instance, last year about this time, I was shooting a hummingbird in the rain on a beautiful lichen-covered perch. I just grabbed the camera and the lens and walked out. I didn't have time to grab a raincoat or any of that stuff. So the R5 and the R6 will tolerate that sort of environment.
Easily. I wouldn't even hesitate.
Okay, good to know.
45 megapixels is really a plus. I thought, like you too, Grace, that maybe in low light situations I would have a difficult time with blur, but I've had the cameras shooting warblers at probably a 20th or a 30th of a second, and no issues whatsoever. I think the in-body image stabilization is just so fantastic that you don't have to worry about that. And second,
you're not hand-holding at those slow shutter speeds, are you?
Oh, correct, I am.
You are?
Yeah, always. And the other remarkable thing, I don't know if I just have an unbelievable copy of this lens, but the new 1 to 500 millimeter RF, whatever it is, 4 to 7.1 or 5.6 to 7.1, is the sharpest lens that I've ever experienced anything in the Canon lineup. So even though it's 7.1 at 500 millimeters, as I said with the R system, you're not compromising anymore. So I can jack up the ISO to 3200. And Grace had mentioned there's some new software out now that's not really that new, but it's being used a lot more. So noise has become less of an issue. The camera and lens combination for hand holding and walking around is so sharp, Grace, that you'll be throwing away some of your old stuff. And I'm waiting for the days when they come out with the RF 500 and 600 millimeter.
Oh yeah.
And I had gotten rid of all of my EF lenses except for my 300 2.8, my 600 f4. And I have a macro lens.
I have a question
That's it.
real quickly. One of the features you mentioned, David, was, and I guess we all know about this with mirrorless, is the silent shutter.
Yeah.
Is that something that would appeal to you, Grace? I mean, does that make a big difference out in the field? I mean, keeping silent?
It absolutely does.
Mm-hmm.
The 1DX line has the ability to make your shutter quieter, but there's a lag. And with birds, everything is so quick that, a lag costs you. And I definitely have had birds and mammals jump because the shutter is so noisy. So that is one thing that I'm really looking forward to when I do go mirrorless, is that quiet the ability to shoot so quietly.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought so. And David, I didn't want to interrupt you there, but my next question really was about lenses. So it sounds like you went all in on new lenses as well. Did you experiment with the adapters?
I actually bought, as Grace said, the adapters coming out were, it's kind of like getting the COVID vaccine. It was really difficult. So I actually bought an adapter. I found one on Best Buy. I bought it before I had the camera. Yes, the adapters work seamlessly. I carry two of them just in case one fails. So it's just like you have two lenses when you go out shooting, or two bodies. I have two adapters as well. Mm-hmm. And I went all in. I got rid of some beautiful glass, 85 1.2, my 50 1.2. All of those are gone, but now I have a new 50 1.2 and a new 85 1.2. I like to shoot other things besides.
And did you keep your old birds. Bodies, or you got rid of those too?
Everything is gone.
Oh my gosh!
So I have I have an R5 and an R6 and a small Rebel that I'll let my daughters use.
And Grace, what do you think? I mean, when you do make the switch, will you keep your old gear? Will you keep lenses? Have you thought that process through just yet?
Money is always a bit of an issue.
Yeah, of course.
And I don't think I'm going to take the plunge as fully as David did. I'll start with probably the R5 and an adapter, and keep the 600 obviously as my main bird lens. I'm really tempted by that 100 to 500, and my husband shoots as well. He splits his time between music and photography, so he's not as involved in it as I am, but he loves flight work, and that 100 to 500 I'm sure would make him very happy. So I won't do what David did and sell everything, but little by little we'll start making this transition as time goes by. And I'm not unhappy with my current gear, but if you spend any time on social media, if you have friends who are in photography clubs and whatnot, there are pictures being presented now that you just never saw in the past. Obviously, the ultimate outcome is based on the photographer's skill, as David so eloquently pointed out. You're never going to surpass that. You still have to know what you're doing. You have to read the manual. You have to learn how to set up your camera. You have to be quick. You have to have good reflexes. You have to know where to look. But some of the stuff that I'm seeing is just killer. Flight shots, birds taking off from perches, and you really have to credit the technology for some of what we're seeing. Mm-hmm. So time to jump in with both feet here and embrace it.
One of the things that you're talking about using a 600 millimeter lens, and I mentioned I worked on the videos for the introduction of the new cameras, and we had the 600 and 800 millimeter, the RF F11, the IS STM lenses, and I used to use handhold a 500 f5 mirror on my Nikons a lot, manual focus. It was a bear, but when it worked, it was just incredibly good lens. So I know how unwieldy these things are and hard to use, even with autofocus. I mean, it takes a lot of skill to manage those kind of lenses. The 600 and 800 millimeter mirror lens, not mirrors, excuse me, the STM lenses from Canon, they're ridiculously small. They're the size, not much bigger than a 70 to 200. The 800 millimeter lens, it weighs 2.77 pounds. that is a huge difference from what you have. And as far as the accuracy, I already spoke about it. It's incredible. It was hard to take a bad picture with these lenses. And then we're talking about huge magnifications too.
So, Alan, am I correct, though, that those are f11s?
Yes, that's
those
correct.
Those are f11s.
But just keep one thing in mind. You're looking through a high-def EVF, so this brightens up. That was a concern of mine, because even f5, 6, and f8, when I was using longer lenses and mirrors and stuff like that, it's hard to see. That's not an issue here at all. It's compensated.
Alan, if I could just interject.
Please.
F11 for a bird photographer that's shooting songbirds is not ideal. So that's the only drawback of those lenses is the F11 and probably build quality. If I was just shooting like large birds at the shore, like you were, egrets and herons, great lens.
Well, that's why I stick to that stuff.
Yeah.
But what's can you elaborate on that a little bit, David? Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, is it the aperture itself? What is it? Is it the f11 that's a trouble, or is the speed in general?
Correct.
Because you already said that your ISO compensates. I mean, I still freak out when I put my my ISO sensitivity to 1,000. I say to myself, "That's crazy. It's grainy." No,
I think the same thing. Still,
yeah, it's hard. It's a hard habit to break.
You have to trust the technology and move with the times, man.
Mm-hmm.
But basically,
yeah, Alan,
I'm trying.
Part of with shooting songbirds is to separate the bird from the background.
Okay.
So if you're at f11, you're going to get too much of the background in focus.
Even if you're relatively close, it still makes that much of a difference when you say.
Yeah, because the bird's so small and everything is so close. So if there's a branch that's half a centimeter behind the bird, that's going to show up more in focus on f11 than if I was shooting at 5.6 or 6.3.
Yeah.
And Grace, I want to ask you kind of the same question. I mean, would you agree? And I know you shoot, in addition to birds, you shoot wildlife and larger animals. Would an f11 lens, given its size and its affordability, appeal to you?
I'm not going to say never, but I don't see it at this point in time. I think what really separates a person who tries to look at photography as an art form versus somebody who just looks at it as a way to document. And I'm not judging, there's a place, for whatever it is that you want to do. But if you're trying to create artful photos, I don't think you're ever going to be super pleased with an F11. We want those deliciously blurred, out of focus backgrounds, ones that enable us to set our subject, be it a bird or a mammal or whatever, away from its background, and it becomes a matter of style as much as anything. So I don't see myself giving up the 600 f4 anytime soon. You mentioned them being unwieldy, and they are. I think it helps if you're going to try to shoot with a long lens to do whatever it is to keep your own strength up. I rely as much on balance when I'm shooting handheld with the 600 as I do on strength. The beauty of the new 600 version 3 is the weight is tipped more toward you. So by kind of resting it on your face and on your left hand, you can achieve a great amount of stability.
Okay, we are going to take a short break, and we come back more about taking pictures of birds with long lenses, etc. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. The best way to support the show is by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For links to gear and more information on today's guests, check out the show notes in your podcast app or visit our homepage on the B&H Explorer website and join the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group. And now, back to the show.
Okay, we are back. Grace, earlier you were talking about how you hand hold a lot of these longer lenses and you use your body itself to gimbal yourself and steady yourself. You want to get into that a little bit more? Any other tools or tricks you use to shoot with these long lenses?
Sure. One of the most popular ones is if you can kneel and balance your let's say your left elbow on your left knee, you kind of turn yourself then into a tripod. And that's a good one. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you either that I handhold all the time. My preferred method still is with a big lens on a tripod. There's just no getting away from that in terms of stability and sharpness. And the tripod that I've been the most satisfied with is the Really Right Stuff. Little bit heavy, but it's solid as a rock. And then I use a Wimberley gimbal head on it.
Oh, yeah.
Perfectly balanced. And then you still do have to pay close attention to long lens technique. You don't want any shake in your motion. You want to depress your shutter softly, do whatever it is you can to stabilize the lens, be it to drape your left arm over the top or push up a little bit from the bottom. So I think no matter what you shoot with, you have to be careful about being as still as you possibly can to enhance the sharpness of your pictures.
For whatever it's worth, one of the tricks that I used to use and still do, I have a Leica table pod, which is a very sturdy little mini tripod. And I've often mounted my camera and lens on that, and I use it as a chest pod. So I have the 3 legs against my chest, and I have 2 arms on the 2 hands on the camera, and it's resting against my face. So it's like 6 points. And I've handheld the 500 at a 15th of a second and nailed the cover doing that. Don't ask me to do it again. And I shot a roll of film to get it. But that's a technique that I've used. And again, I even on unstable platforms, like I used to shoot from boats, that helped a lot. And
Perfect.
Again, you're not tripping over a tripod. It's easy to carry.
Yeah.
If I can interject quickly.
Please.
With my complete transformation to mirrorless and all the new RF lenses, I also changed my support. So I too have moved to Really Right Stuff tripods many years ago, but I finally got rid of what equivalent to a Gitzo Series 3, and I moved to like a Series 2 tripod. And part of the reason I was able to do that is, as Grace had mentioned before, that the 600 millimeter version 3 Canon F4 has gone down to like 7 pounds or so. It's not that heavy.
I actually wanted to ask you, Grace, when you were talking about some of the physical things you do, can you talk a little bit about breathing? Is that something you concern yourself with? Do you hold your breath in certain ways?
Absolutely. If you know that you're going to be shooting at a very slow shutter speed, I find the best thing to do is to exhale and to press the shutter button on the downward-most part of the exhale. It's every little thing you can do to reduce any kind of movement. And I was kind of laughing too. David was talking about shedding a few pounds in terms of his camera gear. I've been working on shedding a few pounds off my physical body and also trying to increase my strength, because you just, be it a matter of walking from your apartment to Central Park or walking around my rocky land or whatever, I think the better shape that you are physically in, the more opportunities you're going to be able to create for yourself. And it just kind of goes hand in hand.
By the way, you did mention an important thing about exhaling, and a lot of people are under the thing, no, you take a deep breath and you hold it steady. No, because when you breathe in and hold it, you're actually increasing your pulse, and it magnifies everything, all the vibrations in your body. And so it's right, when you exhale, your body is relaxed and there is less vibration from you.
Right. Right. It doesn't seem like much, but again, if you're at a really slow shutter speed, it matters. And
yeah.
I had a real unique opportunity shortly after we moved in here. I was at the top of our lane trying to photograph some cardinals, and it wasn't working out too well. They were really chattery, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong. I thought they were reacting to me. I said, well, maybe they have a nest in the vicinity or whatever. So I said, let me get out of here and leave them alone. So I walked out of the brush, walked down the lane, and this huge great horned owl flushed out in front of me. And here, that's what the cardinals had been reacting to, was this bird. So he flew down the lane and landed in one of our fields. And it just so happened that it was in May. They were filled with these beautiful purple flowers called prairie verbena and yellow flowers. And the owl sat there. He caught something. I couldn't quite tell if it was a worm or a small snake or what it was, but the sun had set. So I was hand holding the 600 f4 with the 1.4 in really low light, and you have an amazing opportunity. So I guess my point in telling you that story is just anticipate that you're going to have some conditions that require you to be as in shape as possible, as familiar with your gear as possible, so that you don't blow it when something great like that happens. And what my approach to that situation was too was to take a lot of shots because I knew that they were not all going to be sharp. But I did get quite a few that I really like, and one of them actually is hanging in our kitchen right now.
Oh, wonderful. Also, being prepared at all times because you had no expectation that there was going to be, that opportunity. I imagine.
Exactly.
Yeah. You can't say on your mark, get set, go to a bird. It just does not work. Or on the count of 3, do this. No, the reflexes are everything. It's incredibly precise that you have to be.
Alan, yes. But you sorry, Grace, but I talk to the birds all the time. I'm like, come on, bird, move. Bird, it's time for it. Bird, it's time for you to fly. Bird, turn your head. Bird, start swimming. You should ask my daughters, and then
as long as they don't start talking back to you, then we're probably all right.
Well, they, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'll have my 12-year-old, if she's out with me, I'll say, Felicity, talk to the bird for me because you're a good luck charm. Like, so, yes, I think, Grace, do you talk to the birds ever?
No, I don't really talk to them because I, don't want to make any noise, but
in your head.
What I try to do is to anticipate what I would like to see happen. And one of my good friends used to say, you have to be the bird, so I sit there and I try to imagine, okay, what is he going to do next? Is he going to turn? Is he going to fly? Is he going to drop down and take a bath or whatever? You just try to anticipate, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. I was just going to make the comment too, that nature photography is, I feel, one of the most difficult avenues of photography that you can pursue because you are really not in control of much. The subjects, they're going to do what they want to do. You don't have control over the light, unlike a studio where you set up the lights and everything like that. You first have to find the subject. So for that reason alone, I think embracing the best technology that you can afford is a good idea. Like, tip the scales in your favor.
Well, another one of my mantras, and I completely agree, Grace, is, and you kind of alluded to this, I do say to myself, kind of like in a Zen way, be one with the bird, be one with the bird. And you kind of just trying to think of anticipate what they're going to do. And I had mentioned this in previous podcasts. I've been a birder for a really long time. And part of the skill set, what makes a really good bird photographer, is being a really good birder.
Yeah, Dave, one of the things that you mentioned a little bit earlier, we were talking about the EVF, and you mentioned you had some thoughts about that too during our break. Let's hear about that, because again, the EVF, sure, I think was an important issue deciding between DSLR and mirrorless.
Totally. What's happened is so many people now, including myself, are so used to electronic viewfinders when you're taking your iPhone pictures or Android pictures. And that's an EVF. And until the pervasiveness of phone pictures, which I take a million of, you got comfortable with the technology. I don't think that, at least on the Canon end, the image, the view, the EVF quality was as good as a mirrored box in previous iterations of before the R5 and R6. I think the EOS R was a big step up, but the R5 and R6 have just such high pixel densities. The lag is not huge anymore. That, like, if you've ever saw like the first iterations of the Olympus or first Sony that came out, the lag was just terrible. So
the shadows would block up, the highlights would burn out, and everything would smear if you moved. They were like 190 something thousand dots. They were nothing. It was crude.
Right. So that was a huge factor, because as a bird photographer, if you're not using the screen and you're actually using the viewfinder, you have to be able to see.
Yes.
Well, otherwise you can't shoot. So it's finally gotten to the point where it's great. And the other cool thing, which I kind of like, when you're shooting at a high frame rate and you're looking in the R5 and it's going boom, 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 it's like a video game.
Yes.
It kind of like freezes each shot.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, so I feel like I'm in a first person shooter. So it's so much freaking fun.
Doesn't that confuse you a little bit though? I found that
Yes,
to some degree, I feel like I'm looking at the image I just shot instead of the next image. You know what I mean?
It's slightly disorienting, but on the other hand, it's
that's what you
really
adapt
cool.
to. Again, it's the new. It's you know, let's back up a little bit. You know, it wasn't too long ago that when we took pictures, we were looking at the a ground glass with an upside down backward image that was dull. You know, we've come a long way. We've come a long way.
It's so for those who are thinking about switching, this is no longer an issue. Again, you have to get a little bit over what John had mentioned with the little disorientation, but it's kind of cool and well worth it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, I kind of wanted to change directions a little bit because Grace, you were talking earlier about your land, and if you don't mind, I was kind of curious if you could describe, you know, your space, your land, and I know also that you're involved in the land stewardship program.
Yes.
So first of all, I want to hear all about it, but also it's pretty great, and maybe David, you can agree that, you know, you don't have to trudge to Central Park or out to, you know, Jamaica Bay. You just walk out your backyard and you have your photographing opportunities right there, right?
Right.
It's pretty special. I will say that it's not as easy though as you might think. Texas is vast. These birds have absolutely no reason to stick around and be photographed. Their first instinct is going to be to fly away from you. Now, we encourage them to come in by providing food, which is valuable in this season, but even more valuable in these hot Texas summers is water. So Ted and I built this little feature out of some rocks and a little solar pump, and you know that is hugely attractive to the birds. We have another one that's on the ground level. It's a drip. We put a little mister system out, and we also have what's called a game guzzler out in one of the fields. It's a big 100-gallon tank that has a metal roof on top of it, and the rain, when we get rain, which is rare, flows across the roof down into a little gutter and into the tank, and then is dispensed with a little drip pan and a float valve. So there's lots of water sources, and that's really as important to the creatures. And I'm not talking about just birds. We regularly see fox, bobcat, ringtails, raccoons, whitetail deer. The occasional feral hog wanders in. So that's how I've kind of come about to draw in some of these animals. And I do hike around a lot. Oftentimes I don't get a single picture, but it helps me to learn where things are, where to look. And we've only been here, I guess this is our third year. So we're still, I would say, definitely in the learning phase. But the program that we're a part of is really quite ingenious. Back in the 1960s, Texas ranchers were really being squeezed in terms of their taxes, because there had been drought, a lot of the land had been overgrazed, and they were being taxed on the market value of their land, which was increasing, while the productive value of their land was decreasing. So laws were passed to enable ag land to be taxed based on the productive value of the land, which was enormously helpful. And then as time passed, ranchers stopped ranching. It just became less profitable. The weather became more challenging. So the Constitution and the tax code was changed to allow wildlife management to be treated as an ag exemption. So we basically are farmers, but our focus is on wildlife. So we have 14 acres here, which by Texas standards is tiny. One of the acres is taken out and taxed normally because that's our residence. And the other 13 acres are taxed under this wildlife ag exemption, which is basically peanuts. But it doesn't come free. We have to file an annual plan telling what it is that we're going to do. The state has defined 7 practices, and we have to choose 3 out of those 7 to employ. And then we also have to file an annual report telling what it is that we did, complete with a maintenance log that's contemporaneous, photographs, receipts for stuff that we've spent. And, the expenditures vary from year to year. When we first got here, one of our big goals was to take what they call the upland, it's about 7 acres, and return it to a savanna grassland. It had been totally invaded with ash juniper to the point where you couldn't even walk through it. It was just so dense, a lot of dead. So we spent a lot of time. We had a professional guy come in with a Kubota, ripped out a lot of the old cedar, and we burned it. And ever since then, Ted and I have been kind of just like piecemealing it and trying to take a little more, maintain it, and whatever. So those years were real expensive. I suspect as time goes along, our expenses will decrease. So it's not like we're really saving money by, being involved in this, but we're spending it in the way that we want to, that is approved by the state, for the benefit of wildlife. So pretty special.
That is pretty special. And going forward, are there I don't know, dictates that say, this land won't be changed after it falls out of your ownership, or is that not part of it?
We could sell it to somebody who didn't want to keep it in ag. They'd certainly do that. If Ted and I ever were to take it out of ag, while we live here, there would be huge penalties. We'd have to, they would reevaluate our land based on the last 5 years and tax us accordingly with penalties. But, that's not something that we ever intend to do. That's right. And, we're not spring chickens anymore. And as we get older, if we can't manage this, there are companies that you can hire that will help out with a lot of it. So lots of ways to do it. Texans do value their open space, which is really wonderful. And we're just trying to be good stewards of this little slice of heaven that we have during our lifetime.
Just curious, are you a Texas native?
No, we spent our entire adult life on Long Island.
So this was a natural. It was a natural progression for you,
right?
From Delta, Texas. Of course, it makes sense.
Right. Why not? What drew us to Texas was our daughter's a professional musician, and she got a job with the San Antonio Symphony. So Ted and I retired. We said, you know what? This is no fun, living that far away from her. So our criteria for moving down here was we wanted interesting land. And this little piece has the upland, which is terrific. And then it's got a beautiful ravine with riparian characteristics. So that's where we find the golden cheeks. I had a couple of nice little fox dens down there. So yeah, it's a lesson. And my husband was born and raised in Brooklyn. And if you'd have told me when I married him that he'd be living as a rancher in Texas.
Before we end up the show, because we're getting on time here, can we talk a little bit about some of the software applications you guys are using now for your work?
Sure. Do you want to do this part first, David, and then I'll?
Yeah, I'll shoot, and then you can correct me.
Now you get it.
So, I think the technology and the improvements for wildlife photography are really in the plugins. And for a while, you would use Nick software, which has many different iterations now. The plugins allowed you to have certain filters, so you could, again, increase your contrast, boost your clarity, or your definition, and things like that. The one area that was always kind of lacking was in noise reduction. The inherent noise reduction program in Photoshop has never been great for bird photographers, in that if you reduce noise, it would reduce noise everywhere, including the bird. So you would have this muddy looking bird instead of feather detail. It's really unsightly. And there are still many photographers who don't know how to use noise reduction and get results like that. It's too bad. But recently, Topaz is what I'm going to be focusing on. They have a program called Denoise that's been out for a few years, but the latest iteration of it is just fantastic. So somehow the algorithm is able to remove noise from the background. It can remove noise from the bird, but not take detail away. Again, you have to know how to use the programs properly. You can hit auto, and it does a great job, but it can still create abnormal looking results. So that's again where the keen eye of the photographer, you not just have to be a good capturer of images and know how to take pictures, but you also have to know how to analyze the results of your software. So Topaz is a really great tool. The denoise and their sharpener are really outstanding. But it's something that I've noticed in the field is when I hear not professional photographers talk about their programs or what their techniques are, because any photographer, no matter what level they are, when they're out in the field, they inevitably talk about equipment and how they process and things like that. So I oftentimes listen to their conversations, and they think these programs are a panacea as opposed to a tool. And if you see some of the results, let's say on the New York Twitter bird alert and things like that, I think these people are just putting their pictures up just to be seen first. And they think that adding so much unnatural detail to an image is natural. And I think that you just have to back off on some of the programs a little bit. They're very powerful tools, but again, with anything, you have to understand how to use them and what the results have to be to make things look natural. And I think for somebody like Grace and I, and we understand that. It's kind of a tricky slope because they're so good. It can take an out of focus image, the Topaz sharpener, and actually sharpen an out of focus picture. I don't understand how it does it and how the algorithm works. It's pretty remarkable. But with that, as I had mentioned photography before, there's always a take and a giveaway, a plus and a minus. And sometimes with the software, they could create halos around your subject, chromatic aberration, lots of blues, purples, magentas. And to make your picture look good, if you use it, you should remove your halos, remove the aberration, and then enjoy. Again, they're powerful tools. I use them often, but don't get enamored by it's like in Lord of the Rings, like the power ring. You can't be enamored with everything. You still always have to take a step back.
And is you mentioned this idea of looking natural? Is that really the ultimate goal for you? Is to get it to look quote unquote as natural as possible?
I think that part of why Grace and I get along so well is that we have similar aesthetics. We might shoot different birds and have slightly different interests in our bird photography, but I think both of our Grace can talk about it is to have a natural look. I think for my own personal style, I want the image to be easy to look at. Just have a pleasing background and a pleasing looking bird. If you make your image too sharp or too crispy, you kind of start squinting, and it's not. Yes, John, to answer your question, yes, natural is the best way to be.
I think it's important that when you're photographing things like wildlife, it's not your job to interpret their form and shape, but to record them as they are for what they are.
I would agree with you, but I think we also owe it to them to show them at their best. Yeah. Birds that aren't covered in shadows, aren't covered in branches, maybe a nice singing pose, maybe on a plant that somehow enhances them, tells you a little bit more about their story, is always going to be a lot more appealing. And I just kind of wanted to say something too about David. One of the reasons why I feel he and I get along well is because we're not easily offended. When I'll share a picture with him and he'll write back and he'll go, "That sucks. Look at that halo that you got." I don't go, oh, David, I'm never going to talk to him again. I go, wow, you know what? Let me take another look at that. And sure enough, he's right. Or maybe I have something to say. But I guess my point at this moment in time is to say, be open to accepting criticism if indeed you want to improve your own work. And I'll just comment here too, kind of a bugaboo that I have right now is I feel like nature photography and bird photography in general has gotten a little bit messed up because of social media.
Totally.
If you look at the pictures that get the most likes and the most thumbs up or whatever it is on these forums, it's mostly photos where the bird or the subject is just crammed in the frame. You've got no aesthetic, no sense of art, no sense of composition. It's just, wow, look at what I got and how close I can crop it.
The picture came out. Isn't that great?
Right.
That's really what it was. And in many cases, the picture came out.
Right.
Look at that. You can see
Alan,
the face.
we had discussed this, or John, we had discussed this before, and I called it monster bird.
Yep.
So it's where the bird is the frame. And I personally, through partly looking at Grace's work over the years, I have pulled back immensely on the bird in the frame. I don't always go for all bird. Right. I think the environment is such an important part. Again, when you look at my stuff, the bird's still going to be the focal point, but I embrace a lot more of what Grace is talking about. It's so important. Right. And neither of us, another big trend in bird photography these days is setting up your subject, which is bringing a perch with you that's beautiful and having an elaborate sound system and trying to attract the bird, whether with food or with sound, to hit your beautiful perch.
Well, when I go fishing, I bring my own fish.
Well,
I never go home empty-handed ever.
So when you take that trophy picture, Alan, you just take it out of the cooler and you hold it up.
Yeah, but that's our secret. Don't tell anybody. It's just between us, okay? It's our secret here. Okay, we can go on for a long time about this. There's plenty to talk about here, but time is a factor. David, if people want to see more of your work, where should they go to?
Oh, thanks, Alan. www.lilybirds.com, LILIBIRDS.com, named after my oldest daughter, Liliana. I've had some web difficulties lately, but it's back up and running.
That's good. And by the way, all of this information will be in the show notes. And Grace, what about yourself?
Mine is a little tricky. I wish I could come up with something a little more clever, but it's www.gracescalzophotography.com.
Works for me.
Great, thank you.
Okay. By the way, if any of our listeners are listening to this craziness about birds and you want to know a little bit more about bird behavior, I want to recommend a book called The Bird Way by Jennifer Ackerman. It's an amazing book. She's written several books on bird behavior. She's got like 30 years experience with it. It's an eye-opener, and you might understand why people find birds that much more fascinating. In the meantime, before we go on, we just want to make a quick plug for an upcoming virtual photography conference. It's called the Musea Gathering, or just the Gathering, and it will be held next week, February 22nd and 23rd. It's a wedding and family photography conference that B&H has a hand in supporting, and you may recognize from our show some of the incredible photographers participating. It's a really interesting conference that focuses on the importance of personal work, maturing your personal vision, and helping you change the conversation around wedding and family photography. Check the link in our show notes if you're interested. It's the Musea Gathering. Also, before we go any further, thank you, David, and thank you, Grace, for joining us today. It was a wonderful, wonderful conversation, and we hope to have you both back on the show again sometime in the future.
Thank you. Love being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
That's great. And if you'd like John Harris to personally call you when the latest episode of B&H Photography Podcast goes live, it's easy. Here's all you have to do. Head on over to wherever you get your podcast, type B&H Photography Podcast into the search field, and boom, we're officially cousins. You can also find us on the B&H Explorer website and on the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group. That said, my name is Alan Weitz, and on behalf of John Harris and Jason Tables, thank you oh so much for tuning in today.